Matthew chapter 5 verse 27 through to 42. Today's reading captures some of the teaching of Jesus to his disciples on the mountainside. Jesus has been announcing the arrival of a new kingdom and then unpacking with his disciples what it looks like to live in this new kingdom. He's not done away with the Old Testament laws and rules, but I think he's doing two things. One, redefining them and magnifying them to show how it's about a change of heart. You know, as we read, it's not enough not to murder. You have to address anger. It's not enough to say, well, I never committed adultery. You have to address lust. So firstly, Jesus is magnifying and redefining the Old Testament laws. But then, number two, he's showing us that actually none of us could achieve that holiness or that righteousness anyway through them. None were good enough. And he's setting the scene for grace, for a transforming of the human heart that will empower us to live in that holiness and fulfill those laws. So when it says, if you have lust, gouge your eye out or cut your hand off, if it will lead you to sin, I do think Jesus is using hyperbole here, a way of teaching in the ancient world that used exaggeration. It's not literal, like, we might say, I love you to the moon and back, or I could eat a horse. It's for emphasis, exaggeration. But what it emphasizes is our utter inability to achieve God's perfect standard of righteousness for ourselves. Jesus is setting the scene for a new way of living in grace. So verse 31, this little section on divorce. And it does follow the pattern that we've seen so far. Here's the Old Testament standard, and here's that standard magnified in the new kingdom. And I think what's happening here is that Jesus is intentionally challenging the teaching of the Pharisees and the religious rulers and leaders of the day. They were twisting scriptures so that the scriptures suited them and worked for them for their own benefit. So just to summarize this, firstly from creation, Genesis, we see that marriage is a covenant, a permanent bond. That is God's intention for marriage. Secondly, as we move through the law of Moses, we see that it protected wives from being needlessly divorced by their husbands. God's standard set at creation was that marriage was a permanent covenant bond, but God allowed a concession to that due to fallen, broken human nature. So at the time of Moses, restrictions were set to limit needless divorce. You had to go to the priest to get a certificate from the priest to authorize it. By the time of Jesus, it had become incredibly easy for a husband to get a divorce from his wife, but impossible for the wife. It was seen as a man's right. Women were not protected, and so they risked losing everything. So more than anything, I think what Jesus is saying here is he's condemning the sin of groundless divorce. A little bit like what we see in the book of Malachi, where it says they were abandoning the wives of their youth for younger women from neighbouring nations. Or a little bit like what we see in some cultures today, where actually a guy can just divorce his wife by texting her, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you 3 times. And religiously, that's it. She's done for. She has to go fend for herself in some extreme Islamic cultures. The same principle is happening here when we're talking about oaths. A situation where a person has to make a promise to another person, for example, to repay money, and so they'd swear an oath. I swear by my head that I will repay you the money. I swear by the temple that I will do it. And the Pharisees then would say, well, that oath doesn't really count, but that one does. It was just giving people get-out clauses, leading people to believe that they were not guilty and absolved from their actions. And Jesus is saying, do not live in that way in this new kingdom. Keep your word. Simply keep your word. And I know we can't base what we believe on marriage and divorce on a single verse here. And I know that there's a range of views on marriage and divorce within the church. But just to summarize what I think this passage is saying and what I think the Bible teaches about marriage is that marriage is a permanent bond. It should not be broken, but the Bible also acknowledges that the world is broken and humanity is fallen. And even in the Old Testament, we see that God allows concessions for the breaking of marriage. What Jesus does is he affirms this using marital unfaithfulness as an example, adultery as an example. But the whole thrust of the passage is more about protecting women's rights within marriage. It's about calling people to a higher standard within this new kingdom, and it's exposing our utter need for God's grace in order to live in this kingdom in a way that pleases the King. And so I pray that you will know God's grace abounding to you today in your areas of need. I pray you will know his grace abounding to you in your relationships as you seek him this day. Amen.